Maybe here we can go to Gopal and take this conversation in a little bit of a different direction. We talked about labor migrants. We talked about migrants in countries of destination and documentation in that context, meaning in the context of destination. But my question to you, Gopal, and Gopal, you've been someone who followed very closely the GCM and the GCR, and obviously APRIN as a refugee rights network. You are very much concerned with the question of refugees, mixed flows, but also on migrant workers. And my question to you is looking at the issue of documentation from the perspective of this is a migrant, this is a refugee, this is someone in mixed situations. Is it helpful, or does it even complicate our lives even more with people being, asked to do different things because of different statuses? I see. Before we go to you, I see the poll is finally working. So let's try to vote on the poll, and then we'll go to you, Gopal and Rakesh. Let me know when this is done. Is it done?
We are sharing in the chat box.
Okay, so we'll share this in the chat box. Gopal, we go to you now.
All right. Thank you, Rola. First of all, inviting me in this very, very important platform. And I'm so honored to be part of the distinguished panelists who have time-tested and time-honored experience in the field of documentation of the migratory flow. Yes, I would like to set up some context with regards to what happens with regards to non-documentation and what are the key challenges and how can we fix it actually. So what we can see is in across the globe there is about 1.1 billion individuals lack legal identity, and out of the migrants or total migrants, 10% plus minus are in irregular condition. So being irregular, as has been already highlighted by our previous speakers, that that means there is an absence of state's acknowledgement of the existence and their legal status. That means it prevents the critically important state protection, including basically the right to education. Our participants are also writing on the chat box with regards to right to education of children, the healthcare, freedom of movement, and of course primarily the access to justice. This is because of the existing discriminatory laws and gaps or gaps in the laws which are found in most of the host countries or countries of destination. So who suffers the most? Again, among the migrants here is, the disproportionate impact is faced by on the basis of race, on the basis of ethnicity and linguistic and religious and other minorities, context. So there are victims, but there are hardest hit victims among the victims too. So I think that point needs to be taken into consideration while we are talking about documentation. And how do this stem is this is basically because of the arbitrary application of laws in most of the countries, or very weak civil registration which have seen, or administrative and practical barriers, or even combination of all. So in this context, so living undocumented or underdocumented, or people in the state of statelessness, or even without effective citizenship, that means is preventing millions from reaching their full human potential, and migrants are the hardest hit. Here I will talk a little bit about what mixed migration is, but let me allow to focus on the impact first, because it also marginalizes the entire communities. It is not only an individual, but the entire family, the society, the community. So in some cases, it even fuels discontent or even conflict and even further displacement. And that people after displacement have to take irregular path. So, in some, it's all associated with this, existence. So they exist, but at the same time they do not exist because the law of the land of the particular country doesn't recognize them. So here, for every single people on the move, it could be refugees and asylum seekers, or even rejected asylum seekers, or victims of trafficking, or or smuggled migrants, or even unaccompanied and separated children, or regular migrants, or overseas contractual laborers who travel on a regular documentation, or stranded migrants, or other stateless person, or other like vulnerable migrants, such as the displaces due to climate or disaster, other forms of disaster. So here the key question is now the first ticket to long haul life journey is birth registration. I think that should be established as a universal principle, which as a non-negotiable or kind of approach. Second is about other vital registration. Like there are examples in some countries where refugees are allowed for birth registration, but their death and migration and marriage and divorce kind of documentation is not allowed. We have case example even in my own country, especially for Tibetan refugees. So the vital registration is license to survive. So it's a state recognition of the presence and existence of the person, an individual and a human being is a must. So the good news is in some countries there are the vital registration is issued by the national registration scheme. So the authorities will do the same design and specification which is applied to documentation of the local nationals. But in many countries it's not happening. In the case of refugees, there are mixed kind of models. In some countries, it is a joint project with UNHCR and the host country. And in some countries, it is only the government, and like in Korea and in Japan. And in some countries, it's not the government, but the UNHCR provides this kind of ID cards with UNHCR logo. So there are different kind of models applied in different contexts. So going back to your question, Rola, about understanding how because there is a conceptual unclarity about the mixed migration. What constitutes mixed migration, and then how? Like for example, if you talk about one category of unaccompanied child, but the unaccompanied child also could be an asylum seeker at the same time. And then so irregular migration, since it's so common form of movement across the globe, mixed migration flows is also an accurate reflection of the diversity of migration itself. So that needs to be recognized, that needs to be realized by all stakeholders. But unfortunately, vast majority of our migrants in mixed migratory flows do not fit any particular level, particularly in terms of established legal category. I think that needs to be changed, that needs to be altered. So this is all about the conceptual clarity, because varieties of people for different reasons with different aims and objectives keep traveling. People do travel; it's a natural phenomenon. So, but the countries, particularly the countries in destination, should have what we call is comprehensive preparedness to deal with mixed migratory flow with different kind of protocols and approaches, because people don't put the people on the same basket, because there are people with varieties of needs. As I already mentioned, there are asylum seekers, there are sick, there are elderly, there are children, there are pregnant women, there are like students or probably economic migrants, or varieties of people. So, but most of the time, on the basis of what we call is securitization migration, every single people on the move has been put on a single basket. I think here lies the critical and crux of the problem. So there are many other kind of approaches that can be taken. For example, one of our colleagues already mentioned about exploring non-custodial alternatives in terms of immigration detention, for example, and also identification of the victims and survivors on the move, and the persecution of all forms of violence is so much important, particularly in both in the country of origin as well as in the country of destination. And then the law. Now the question is about law enforcement agencies and border officials needs to be trained accordingly. The training service should be catered accordingly, because they should be smart enough, to isolate and to find out and to categorize through proper screening and documentation of what the motive, and they should be allowed to, in a way, have their say on their claim, like why are they coming there, So I think so. In totality, I'm talking about the putting protection sensitive reception as a priority. I think that's the crux of the problem. And then when the protection sensitive reception is there in every single countries of destination, then the like 80% or 90% problem is solved, because that would categorize the motivation of people coming there. So that is the most important kind of approach, which has also been derived in many instruments, including the 2018 both the Global Compact for Migration and Refugees, and there are many other exercises and mechanics already there, particularly in intergovernmental initiatives. I don't have time to name everyone, but the UNHCR, World Bank, and there are many declarations in the Great Lakes region, Arab League's ministerial declaration on legal identity, Africa program on vital statistics, and regional strategic plan in the Asia Pacific on vital statistics, EU, and there are many other places, instruments and mechanisms already in place that needs to be mobilized, that needs to be utilized fullest in this connection.
Thanks, Gopal. No, and I really like what you said on, yes, we shouldn't put people in the same basket in the sense of, not treating everybody the same. And you are arguing for doing this on the basis of needs, right? This is what you said,
Yep.
Treat people based on the basis of needs. But at the same time, and especially in what you've mentioned in the context of mixed migration, in the context of labor migration, in the context of refugee movement, there are certain hierarchies, if we can say, right? There are certain hierarchies in terms of what kind of documentation you possess. A refugee in possession of a refugee documentation, for instance, is somebody who is entitled to international protection. In the GCM, there was always the struggle of how do we, kind of expand this protection to migrants. So there is that, and I mean, one perfect example that comes to mind is Egypt, for instance, where because of the fluidity in these kinds of movements, in the mixed migration movements, and the advantages of a refugee status, everybody that applies for asylum, virtually everybody that can applies for asylum, for instance, because there are these kinds of hierarchies. But let me ask you this, Gopal, because you're saying that let's treat people on the basis of needs, and you've made a very good case on the documentation of the different groups. But do you think documentation is such a key concept that if it remains and if it expands, and if we adopt this concept of needing to document everybody and every movement and all of this, we will risk not realizing the SDG 16, which is on inclusive societies. You think there's a trade-off here between inclusion and then adopting a position which is very pro-documentation and pro-differentiating between different categories of people on the move?
Yeah, wonderful question, actually. First of all, as Madam Pia also already mentioned about some of the human rights-based approaches to be applied for all people on the move. That includes all the categories that has been mentioned earlier. So certain principles needs to be in place. For example, the principle of non-refoulement, which is always somehow is still debatable in the GCM, but there has been the terminology as such has not been mentioned categorically, but overall the language also speaks that the states are committed for non-refoulement somehow. So I think the principle of non-refoulement should be, or non-deportation should be, I think, the critical part of the overall approach. And secondly, non-criminalization. I think this makes a lot of sense because many people on the move also arrive without proper documentation or forged documentation, because that is actually required for their own survival and protection, because whenever their life is in threat and people do come. I give you an example. One Somalian refugee arrived in Nepal with an original Swedish passport, but later on the UNHCR, through its screening process, came to know that, well, the guy was a real, genuine asylum seeker refugee, but he was holding a forced passport. So on that basis, the person was not criminalized. One great example. So non-criminalization on the basis of the documentation or the status or how the people reach to the border should be a fundamental kind of approach, and because it is so important to realize the fact that people do take a dangerous journey for their safety and protection of their families, etc., particularly in the case of asylum seekers. So non-criminalization on the basis of on the face value, what you call the prima facie, and again, as Madam P also already emphasized about the principle of non-discrimination on the basis of the race, origin, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, gender, disability, and other forms. So I think these human rights based approaches, which are very much part of the all international human rights instruments, including these languages have been somehow spilled out in the Global Compact for migration as well as refugees. I think those particular themes, particular components needs to be, I think, amplified by the civil society as a top priority. But at the same time, so registering systematically and recording all these, the arrival and vital events of everyone, refugees and migrants within their, within the National Civil Registry, it should be the focus that we have. Let's reiterate that, number one. And number two, what I'm trying to say is about, yes, it is important, to also process in a differentiated, technique and tool on case-by-case basis. But the purpose is not to exclude, but to include everyone, but again to identify the particular protection needs of each vulnerable individual. So that is the thirst behind my saying about need-based, differentiated protocol and processes, but not to discriminate anyone or not to criminalize anyone. And finally, because for people on the move, it is important, particularly in mixed migratory flow, it is important to recognize the immediate physical, medical, and psychological needs of an individual. So the person should be taken as an individual, because people might need urgent attention. And so that should be, because there are referral processes, there are shelters and reception facilities, everything. But before sending the people to the shelters or referral or reception or any other facilities, I'm mostly talking about vulnerably moving population or people crossing the borders, that the attention should be given to address their physical, medical, and psychological needs. So in totality, what I mean to say is that mixed migration mobility needs to be recognized, and then so the preparation on the part of the what you call protection sensitive reception modalities is the demand of the day. So the other procedure as which I mentioned earlier needs to be in place accordingly.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Gopal, for this clarification as well.